Um, so thanks, Dwayne, for the introduction, and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Um, yeah, it's a pleasure to be able to share my work with you today in this iteration of the Spiral seminar. And I'm looking forward to the discussion that follows. So for today, I'm going to present my practice and my process, which I often summarize as filming ghosts, silences, and hidden things, as Dwayne said. Over the next couple of minutes, I want to introduce three projects that I've worked on in the past couple of years. So the first is called Journey with John, and I co-directed this with a friend, Srinivas Reddy, in 2017 in Hungary. The second, Lagos Lagos, which I made in 2018 in Portugal. And the final one is called Rosenfilde, and I actually literally just completed this past month. And I made it here in Berlin as part of a residency with De Coloniale. So using these three as case studies, what I want to outline is how and why I turn to kind of speculation, collaboration, and historical ghosts in response to archival gaps and monumental silences that I encounter, particularly around histories of enslavement and colonialism in the various places that I live and work in. So to begin, I'm going to transport us or invite you to be transported with me to Budapest in 1896 and 2017 simultaneously. So on 30th August 1896, a newspaper article was published entitled African Negroes in the Zoo, A Piece of Africa in Budapest. And it's written about a group of 250 clansmen, as they're called, who've been brought from an area that is now Ghana to be displayed at the Budapest Zoo. The article reads, and I quote, "Care has been taken so that in the zoo, our Negroes follow the way of life which they were accustomed to in their homeland. Every one of them has some craft that they learned from their fathers. The goldsmith is working on a silver ring. The blacksmith is hammering a spearhead. Another one's craft is decorating pumpkin shells by carving ornaments into them by the point of a crude knife. Everyone is doing something," end quote. So as we know, as early as the 1870s, human zoos abounded throughout Euro-America. From Paris to London, Hamburg, New York, and Chicago, displays of so-called exotic people, as you can see in some of the images in the article, gained popularity. And these usually had quite elaborate setups, and they claim to represent the real flora, fauna, and architecture, as well as the native customs and practices of these various regions. And for a small entry fee, these exhibitions did or claimed to do, they gave European patrons the ability to travel kind of deep into the corners of empire and experience so-called lesser civilizations in the flesh without ever having to leave their own shores. Over a century later, around April 2017, my classmate Sini and I stumbled upon this article that I quoted earlier. We had an assignment to make a film about scars, however conceived. And we had decided as two non-white international students that we wanted to explore the history of human zoos and kind of look at that as a scar on the city. Interestingly, I think neither of us had ever been to a zoo at the time. So our first order of business was to take a trip together to the Budapest Zoo. And as we were looking at giraffes, apes, and big cats in cages, we were also imagining the reality that over a century ago, people who probably looked a lot like the two of us would have been here too, except that they would have been on the other side of the bars. And seeing the empty cages, we also toyed with the idea of getting into them. We asked ourselves kind of, what if we shot a performative piece that involved putting our own bodies all this time later into these cages in the same zoo? Back on campus, we ran the idea by our supervisor, Gabo, and our university admin assistant, Mari. And both of them assured us that getting permission to film in the zoo wouldn't be a problem. The media office was known to be very responsive and generally friendly to educational requests. But just in case, they advised us to leave out the parts about getting in cages. So Cindy and I drafted a letter. We introduced ourselves and our project, and we wrote simply and safely that we were students, that we wanted to film a historical project. And we attached the newspaper article just in case. And then later on, the admin assistant, Marisiopis, translated it into Hungarian and sent it with a university letterhead on our behalf. And as promised, the response was swift, but it wasn't quite what we had expected. So I'm going to read from the email that we got. It said, quote, "I've received your letter with thanks, but we do not allow filming. I've been able to check with my colleague in charge of the matter, and what the document outlines as a subject for filming is essentially unreal, as it has not happened at the zoo," end quote. So while our university admin was mostly surprised about the refusal, finding it unbelievable that they would say no to us, to students, I, at the time, was infinitely more dumbstruck by this denial in the face of evidence, i.e., what the document outlines is unreal. This hasn't happened at the zoo. Looking back, I can see that we probably naively relied on the idea of archive as a conversation starter, as a way to approach the fact of this has happened in the past and how can we speak to it from the present. But what do you do when the facts and the archives itself are rejected? And when, despite all the evidence you think you've collected to buttress your point, you're met with revisionism and a complete refusal to engage? This is not real. It hasn't happened. How does one even begin to respond to that? So we went back to our supervisor, Gabo, and he thought it was a fantastic idea and we should film it anyway. But this kind of guerrilla filming wouldn't come without risks, because both Sini and I were non-European students on visas, and getting arrested for filming illegally could jeopardize not only our time in Hungary, but possibly our ability to go anywhere else. I mean, we did it anyway, but this idea of like personal risk also massively changed the idea of the film that we would end up making. So I'm going to show a clip. I think it's about a minute or two from what we did, and then I will talk some more about it.
We are here on this beautiful day in the Budapest Zoo. Behind me, this cage lies empty now. But in 1896, for a limited time, it housed one of the most visited spectacles. Almost 250 Homo sapien negroids, shipped from Accra on the western coast of Africa. We are now in Blaha Luisa Ter in District 8, which has the highest concentration of the Homo sapiens negroid in Budapest, following their release from the zoo. Many of their descendants have migrated here. I invite you to join me today on this never-before-seen expedition into the secret world of the Budapest negroid. I am Sir John Smith, a famous ethnologist from Oxford. I've spent 50 years studying the sub and sub-subclasses of the Homo sapiens species. I am here to reveal my most interesting discoveries.
So due to the limitations on engaging with the past in the ways that we had hoped, we decided to kind of translate our ideas into the future. So the mockumentary that we made, which I showed kind of the introduction to, Journey with John, begins with a character who stands in an annex to the Budapest Zoo, because yeah, we filmed illegally after all, and describes the 1890 exhibition. But then he also kind of quickly returns to the present to look at the lives of Black people in Budapest today. And in doing so, we asked ourselves kind of what if those 250 people had stayed behind after the exhibition? What if they escaped from the zoo? And what if they settled in Budapest, but their descendants continued to be ogled at? And in a way, our imaginings went too far off from reality. Because as a Black person in Budapest myself, I was stared at constantly in shops, in the subway, and on the street. And these kind of National Geographic style or ethnographic documentaries about isolated, untouched tribes still perpetuated the same gaze on Western people. So with this in mind, we created the fictional anthropologist, Sir John Smith from Oxford, a man we imagined that traveled around the city, supposedly studying its non-white populations. We transplanted some of the same language from the article. So the same sense of kind of, in the article, they're marveling about the bodies of the Black people and how they shower and how they're so happy and how they're so industrious, etc. So we kind of kept that perspective. So he's marveling at people drinking, talking, playing pool, etc. But we also pushed it to the extreme. So we added moments in which Sir John overanalyzes, in which he reads far too much into the meaning of everyday gestures like a handshake or a haircut. And in pushing things too far, rather than coming off as an expert, we hoped that he would begin to seem ridiculous. So in the final scene, Sir John, who thinks by now that he's kind of assimilated into the culture and befriended the natives, tries to enter into the homes of one of them to provide us with a never before seen glimpse into an intimate space. But before he can enter into the apartment, the door is slammed in his face. And the film closes as he kind of stands in front of the closed door and stares in shock. And we transition from that into kind of real pictures from the human zoos. And in this way, we hope to bring the audience in on both the joke, but also the painful reality. So how ridiculous we were trying to ask, is it to fashion oneself as an authority on the experience of another? And also how invasive to put people on display like that. Looking back 4 years later, I'm not sure I would make this film in the same way today. I'm not sure I would, I'm not sure I wouldn't, but I will just add, I think that since then, my doubts about repeating kind of the same imagery and the language from the past, even if the point is to criticize it, my doubts about that have grown larger and larger. But at this time, I will say, I still stand behind this film for sure, because it was an early attempt at moving beyond the limits of the archive. And in this case, the limits I'm referring to is kind of a denial of history. So projecting into the past for us was a way to not only insist, yes, this has happened, but also a way to tell a story in a way that we could, having been denied access to the spaces in which it happened, and having kind of the evidence that we relied on being denied as well. So now moving to the second case study, we're jumping a year later, and this time to Lisbon, Portugal. So around this time, it's 2018, and despite having been the center of the slave trade, the city has no official memorial to this history. And after a popular vote by residents, it's decided that one should be built. However, this decision very quickly stalls due to a lot of disagreements about how exactly Portugal should address its history with the African continent. Some of the questions that were around at the time, for instance, were, should the monument be built where the slave ships had unloaded centuries ago in this square called Praça do Comércio, if you're familiar with Lisbon, or should there be a separate and entire museum built devoted to addressing Portugal's history with Africa? Even with these debates, it stalled even longer for years, I will say. Even so now, there's still no museum. It's been going on for 5 years. There was then intense debate about what such a museum could even be called. And some of the suggestions were intercultural museum, museum for the interculturality of Portuguese history, even museum for the interculturality of Portuguese history as world heritage. So while these debates were happening on the public scale, in private, I found that conversations about colonialism were intruding into my everyday life. So on the wall of the bedroom I was renting, there hung a map of the West African coast from, I think, the 1700s that was littered with Portuguese names. So places I recognized, but names that were completely foreign. And in university, a professor would keep reminding me, you know, how unlike the British and the French, who were apparently the terrible colonialists, Portuguese were more like beloved brothers, and that's why the Africans didn't want them to leave. And even out in the city, when I went to open a bank account from, I guess, 5 minutes from where this picture is taken, this, by the way, is one of the proposed locations for the monument. The bank teller asked me if I knew, very proudly, if I knew that Portugal had discovered Africa when he found out where I came from. So in these experiences, I'm recounting them to show, you know, that I was confronted. Unlike Budapest, it was not a denial of history per se. It wasn't so outright, but rather here I felt like I kept encountering a version of events that was romanticized beyond recognition. And so eventually I ended up making a film as well. And in it, it's called Lagos Lagos, and it's kind of an essay film. It's a travelogue. I describe it as an essay travelogue, and it's a collection of stories and narratives from people who have moved between one city and the other. So between Lagos, where I was born, and Lagos in Portugal, where the first enslaved Africans were brought to Europe. And one of the challenges that I had in it, I guess, in collecting the narratives, so I looked through what had been written, the historical archive. So there are books about the discovery of Africa by the Portuguese. There is a British colonialist in the 60s who made the trip from Lagos to Lagos. There are also accounts written by enslaved people who've traveled from one coast to the other. And I also met in Lisbon somebody who had stowed away on a ship and landed in Portugal in the 90s. And one of the interventions that I used in this film, for instance, in reading the Chronicle of the Discoveries, I was very struck by how fantastical it was. So I think normally in history text, you expect, because it's written, that it's accurate. And there were things about them kind of seeing sea monsters and descriptions that didn't seem quite right. And so one thing I wanted to do was to kind of say, well, if there are these Portuguese romanticizations of the story, why don't we also have our own romanticizations of the story? And we do. So I will play a clip first, and then I will talk a bit more about this particular romanticization. Or not romanticization, but this particular mythology that I used.
Ní ìgbà àkọ́kọ́, ìtura àti àlàáfíà ń bẹ. à ń rí àwọn ẹja, ẹyẹ àti nígbà mìíràn ọkọ̀ ojú omi. Àti pé nígbà mìíràn ọkọ̀ kan yóò rìn jìnnà ju àwọn tí ó síwájú rẹ̀ lọ, yóò sì tún padà wálé. Gbogbo àwọn ọ̀rọ̀ irọ́ pé kò síbi tí òkun àti ayé parí sí yóò parẹ́. Wọn yóò sì mú ìròyìn wálé pé ayé kò pín sí ibi tí omi yìí parí sí, ṣùgbọ́n ó jù bẹ́ẹ̀ lọ.
So in a lot of cultures in West Africa, there's this figure called Mamiwata, and she's basically an ocean spirit who is believed to kind of lure and seduce men, especially greedy men who are in search of gold. And she kind of uses her allure and the promises of riches to lure them off their ships, and then they're never seen again. And actually, in a lot of the beliefs, she's said to have been very active in the centuries in which the slave trade was going on, because there were a lot of greedy men going on boats. But when I was reading these kind of fantastical accounts of sea monsters, etc., it just struck me that if these kind of fantastical Portuguese accounts could exist and could be considered credible or parts of the archive or historical or whatever, and if I used them in the film, then I also wanted to have this account of Mamiwata alongside. So for me in the film, you kind of hear accounts from the different people that I mentioned before, and she's one of the characters that you hear from. And these GIFs are just to give a sense, I guess, of the visuals. So because it's a film that's made up of kind of the journeys across the ocean over 600 years, the visuals are just of water, so different things shot underwater or shot through fog, etc. The one exception is the use of archives in the middle. So archival footage, sorry, I also wanted to kind of juxtapose a scene from a port in the past with a similar scene in the present day. So I guess to recap, in the first project, my challenge was kind of what to do when there is a denial. In this one, the challenge was more kind of what to do when there is a romanticization, which was more just that I would then diversify different fantasies and myths that were used. And then the final instance that I'm going to talk about is pretty recent. So I'm going to talk about the film that I made as part of the Decoloniala residence. So as a quick introduction, Decoloniala is a new initiative that's been funded by the city of Berlin over the next 5 years to look at decolonial memory culture in the city. And earlier in the spring, there was a call for projects for residencies based in 3 specific sites. And one of the sites, the one that stuck out to me the most, was the Schloss Friedrichsfelde. So it's a neoclassical, it's called a pleasure palace that's located in the northeast part of Berlin in Tierpark, which is a zoo. So there's this huge zoo, and then it has this big palace, if you can imagine it, in the center. And the palace and the zoo were built around the 1600s. So in 1682, there was this Dutch mariner called Benjamin Rowler, and he founded the Brandenburg African Company. So this was the company that sent an expedition to the Gold Coast, now Ghana, led by Corbin. And there he established the Gross Friedrichsburg Fort. And from this fort, kind of gold, ivory gum, and human beings were traded. And then a year later, with the profits from this trade, he purchased a dilapidated manor and the surrounding land, and with the same money kind of built this palace and also the zoo. So as you can tell from the previous two examples, I'm usually drawn to make films based on my everyday experiences in the places that I live, especially intersections that I notice between the city that I'm in and usually the places that I come from, so Ghana and Nigeria. So obviously I was kind of struck by the idea that here again was a palace that was so lavish, that was built with in part, or for the most part, with profits from slave trading where I'm from. And I was also struck by the silence or lack of discussion about this at all. So not unlike the plantations in the US, where there's no mention of slavery or very little, and they're kind of rented out for Renaissance balls or weddings, etc. If you go to the website of the Schloss Felixfelde, there isn't really any mention at all about the Gold Coast or about the trade. And it's mostly also rented for these kind of fancy weddings and concerts and Renaissance events. So for the residency, I wanted to kind of look at the space and look at, initially anyway, kind of what traces to this past that one could find in the space. And this would change with time, but I will get into that in the next slide. But I was interested first in just looking at the space and drawing a connection with the other image you can see with Gross Friedrichsburg. So here, I guess the challenge that I faced was slightly different, which is there was an absence of the history, but there was no outright denial of it. And it wasn't really a romanticization. Here I found that it was more a challenge of like which history mattered and which history was important. So for instance, a lot of the trying to get permission to film in the Schloss was done by a decoloniale admin, but it took kind of weeks and weeks, and until the last moment, we didn't even know if I would be able to film there. And one of the early excuses that we had, this is my judgment, one of the earliest reasons we had for why I couldn't film there was that there was a historical exhibition going on in one of the rooms. And I find that interesting because it's a way in which like one version of history exists, and because of that, other ones are precluded from taking place. In the end, though, I was allowed 1 day of filming, which is not a lot to make a film. So my initial idea of kind of focusing on the architecture and making a slow observational film shifted drastically. So with 1 day, with not a lot of time, I decided that it would make more sense to collaborate with other people. And I kind of abandoned the idea of making a tidy film and instead thought, okay, the most important thing would be just getting a lot of people, like other Black artists who are engaging in similar topics, and anyway, for a day, having us take up space in this Schloss and do our thing and see what came out of it. So in line with that, I kind of wrote what my main idea was. So that I was interested in this Schloss, that I was interested in the absence of this history in the space. And then my kind of speculative question was that I wondered if the ghosts of history that were being ignored or that were not being acknowledged, if they were suddenly embodied for a day in this castle, what could that look like? So I wrote that. I reached out to some performers, some dancers, musicians, cinematographers, etc. And we all came together and kind of made this film. I will show it after, it's just about 5 minutes. But yeah, the concept being, I guess, what if somebody came and did a ritual and these ghosts came and took you through the Schloss? And what if there was a haunted guided tour of the Schloss in the present day? What could that look like? I'm gonna play it and then I will have some final comments and wrap up and we can discuss. So here in a way, the move to imagining this kind of haunted guided tour, I guess one, it was motivated by a lack of time, like there wasn't enough time to engage with the present. So in terms of thinking, okay, what can we bring into the space? Again, it was possible just to kind of project, okay, what if standing from the present, somebody tried something, and what if the spirits were embodied and could speak to them? It also emerged from the reality of working in the space. So there was a lot of secrecy, particularly around, and hopefully I can say this now, around what the topic of my research actually would be. So I was told, for instance, I had to rewrite a proposal where I wasn't allowed to mention slavery or colonialism at all in what I was going to film. So I had to kind of write something that it's going to be about the building and the details, and they're going to be dancers and kind of talking around the subject. And somehow, in a way, I guess the idea of ghost also didn't trigger anything for anybody in that way. But also what was interesting, because I had mostly thought of this kind of speculation as a way, as like a thing, as a way to translate my ideas. But I found that it was also a good way to connect to other people who are working on similar subjects. So in presenting that I was interested in this history and that I was interested in speculating, a lot of people reached out who were doing similar things in their practice. So Yud, who you see, who kind of does the ritual, had been noticing in Italian chapels, she had had the same feeling that there was a lot of blood and sweat and tears of Black people and Caribbean people. She's from Haiti, that had gone into developing the riches of this place and that were unacknowledged. And so she could relate to what I wanted to do in the Schloss in a similar way. Gugu, who made the sound, also worked frequently with kind of ancestral body noise and composing pieces around the same subject. So it was also a way to connect with her. And I also found it interesting. I don't know if I said, but so I got permission kind of 2-3 weeks before the end of the residency. So it was like 1 week scramble to get everybody together before we shot. So I actually didn't also meet anybody there until the day of the shoot. And also having described to the dancers, like, this is the idea, this is what we're thinking, this is how we want you to move. It was interesting to me that that was also a way that they were able to connect. And so that with the idea of ancestors or spirits or embodiment, everybody was able to somehow be on the same page and relate to the space in a similar way. The last thing I will add, which is an unexpected thing that also came up, probably Ari, Ghosts and Silences. So after we screened the film, as part of the Decoloniale Fest, there was a city tour on the bus. And one of the historians that had been working on the history of this place had said, yeah, like I saw in the film this person who was dressed, and he had kind of read her as an enslaved person from the past, and had said that this is one of the things about this place, that they believe that there had been enslaved people there, even though it's also not acknowledged. And so it was another interesting way in which we kind of created this image without necessarily having that in mind, without even knowing. But in a way, it's, I guess, another possible embodiment that we didn't expect, that it spoke through to somebody, a historian, as representing enslaved people in a way that we hadn't thought about. I'm going to wrap up here. I feel like it's approaching 40 minutes, but thank you all again so much for your time and your attention. And I'm looking forward to talking more. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Nina. That was so stimulating and so inspiring. And your video for Decoloniale is really amazing. It reminded me of the music video by Flying Lotus, Until the Quiet Comes. Do you know that music video? with a dancer in an urban setting, also contemporary dancer, but it's an entirely different setting, but also uses a dancer to drive the narrative of that music video.
And I hope it played okay. Zoom is kind of terrible with streaming, and it was a very low quality version, but I hope you kind of got it.
Yeah, the rhythms as well as the atmosphere of the Rosenfelder Schloss, the castle, was very spooky, and it was a powerful intervention. What struck me about your presentation was also how you used your awareness of your practice, like a careful awareness of your practice, a located awareness of your practice, that in these different places, you're making sense of these different cities that you're in and through and as part of your artistic practice. And I really enjoyed that, and it's refreshing to be invited to step into that space with you. It also reminded me that the interventionist work, especially your mockumentary, reminded me of there was an advertisement in South Africa a few years ago by a popular takeout chain. It was called the Big John Burger. And in the advertisement, the advertising company plays with the idea of Big John making the journey from Africa to discover a place called Europe. And it was well received. But the funny thing was, we received one complaint in South Africa from the South African public that said the advertisement was making light of the serious matter of slavery, and hence the advertisement was pulled from being aired on television, and it went through 2 appeals processes where it was consistently reinforced that because the ad was making light of slavery, the satire that was driving the advertisement was not allowed. So it was just it was an interesting counterpoint, and to the wonderful films that you brought. But I know that Dylan is here, and Dylan probably has many more points.
Yes, thank you so much, Dwayne, and thank you so much, Nena, for sharing that with us. Really powerful work. I really love that. Sorry about the sound that was coming from my iPad now. I was busy swiping other programs to close because it seemed like Zoom was struggling. So I was trying to close other programs, forgetting that when you do that on an iPad, everyone can hear you swipe. So my apologies for that. And I just wanted to start off firstly by saying what important work this is. Nena, I really love what you've done. I remember meeting you a few years ago at the African Storytelling Summer School, and we really got to talk a lot and kind of engage in this shared history also that we have, me coming from South Africa, from Cape Town specifically, and you originating from Ghana, Nigeria. And through your presentation, I found so many resonances with the things I'm interested in my own work, but also just with the history of Cape Town and the history of South Africa. I really loved the way that you used the mockumentary format in your film, Journeys with John. And in particular, I think with all your films, there's a use of the actual and the fictive, right? So using fiction and documentary at the same time. And your film are kind of existing in this space that kind of traverses both fiction and documentary in a sense. And this is a scholar called Dara Waldron who wrote a book called The New Nonfiction Film. And it's the full title is New Nonfiction Film, Art, Poetics, and Documentary Theory. It's a book from 2018. And I think your work fits really well in there, kind of the legacies of Kiarostami from Iran, and looking at John Okamfra from the UK, using fiction to get to a certain truth. So sometimes documentary, in a way, it doesn't quite cut it to get to the truth. And I found really interesting your stories around gaining access, being denied access. And there's a kind of a double denial of being allowed to film, but also a denial of what is happening. So there's this interesting double denial that there's also been happening in your process. But yeah, I really love the use of mockumentary. So kind of traversing this rift between fiction and nonfiction. And that's what Waldron calls the new nonfiction forms. These films are not documentary per se, but they're not quite fiction either. So it's can only be described as a new nonfiction form. And a recent example of that is a film by Ben Russell and Ben Rivers. But really it's kind of looking at how do you get to a certain truth using fiction, or how do you work with documentary elements to actually get to the point that you want to get across, or get to the truth that you want to get across. Currently in documentary, we're seeing there's a certain kind of film that is considered documentary. So you might think, why do we need these new categories like new nonfiction, for example? But I would have said we do because film is developing, film is changing all the time, and documentary has kind of it's the way that the public understands it is very much in this idea of your big picture films, like An Inconvenient Truth is probably the best example. But even looking here in South Africa, the film that won an Oscar, despite being highly subjective and insular, which was My Octopus Teacher, it's still kind of about this big picture idea of man versus nature. And obviously there's the idea of who man actually is. Man is represented by this white guy. I really love the ways that you incorporated humor and deployed whiteness for subversive ends as well. The way that John, this famous ethnographer, and also drawing in the history of the academy as well, and the complicitness of the academy in producing these images and this kind of extractive and exploitative knowledge production, not only in the past, but also quite recently as well, and in the present, in terms of thinking about the ways in which the ways in which knowledge production is produced in Africa, and the power imbalances in the global South with regards to knowledge production. So I thought that was really clever, and I really enjoyed that. I'm not going to say too much because I really would love to, as Dwayne said, for us to have this be more like a casual discussion. But it also really struck me, and I just have to say this, the ways in which the Portuguese, the museum where they were meant to confront their colonial past, I think and you can correct me if I'm wrong, it's Crónica de Guinea, the film that you made, and the museum said they were going to frame this, they're going to use the frame of interculturality to look at this history of colonialism of the Portuguese. And it's interesting, this sense of, you brought it up a couple of times, and also brought up this idea of denial. And there's a kind of deep denial with the refusal to really acknowledge the past and what has happened, and a real silence there. So the work you've done in terms of bringing back the truth through the use of ghosts, I think is really poignant and really important. And South Africa has a similar relationship to the Dutch, and there's a very similar story, and Dwayne will probably know a little bit more about this than I do, but at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, they had an exhibition called Good Hope, which was about, and I'm paraphrasing, but they used words like looking at the shared history between South Africa and the Netherlands. And there's a kind of a cognitive dissonance because they do talk about colonialism, they do talk about slavery, but at the same time they use this kind of strange euphemisms like shared history. There's still kind of a disavowal at play where they're showing what happened, but there's a certain distance between what happened, and there's still this need to frame this as a good story. I mean, the exhibition was called Good Hope, and I think the main picture that they always led with was a picture of Mandela's first speech when he was released from prison after being in prison for 27 years at the end of apartheid. So there's also this interesting ways in which colonialism and the details of that is really denied. Also tried to be reframed as something, as an encounter between two groups, as something that was almost on an equal footing, a shared history, which I think is something that we really need to push back against as much as we can and at every chance we can. And I really want to commend you for doing that work in the films that you're making. And I'm really looking forward to seeing more and to be able to share this with others. So we should talk about this afterward as well. But finally, I also wanted to talk about thinking about reparations and using film as a kind of reparation. So I love the ways in which you, upon not being granted access, you actually find a way to, or you have to find, similar in the ways that the narratives of the past, but you have to use euphemism in order to gain access to film in certain places. And so I want to kind of leave it on that and kind of talk about how do we envisage that? How do we use these strategies and tools as forms of using film as kind of reparations? I kind of see the work you're doing as restorative in that way. And obviously, it's maybe provocative to use reparations in a metaphorical way, but I kind of see the work framed in that light because I feel somewhat restored watching it. But so that's something I would like to end on, and also possibly something that the participants on the call can talk to. It's this idea of how do we actually gain access often to tell these stories when we are met with this double denial, and what are the ethics around that when we need to kind of use a certain language to get in. And I've done this before making films, for example, about gentrification and so on, and having to film in a specific place. I've also had to use very bland language and very nondescript language to get access. So I found that really interesting and a lot of resonance with that in terms of actually when you're doing something subversive, you know, what are the limits of the kind of tools, these kind of euphemistic tools of deception in a way, and when is deception okay to do? But yes, so that was my response today. But I just want to say once again, thank you so much for sharing this with us, and yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing what everyone else has to offer as well. I hope that I've offered something useful.
Thank you so much. I don't know if I should respond or if we move to questions, but no, I mean, I guess very quickly, a lot of things came up. So for instance, with this exhibition about good hope, I think that's also a narrative that I've encountered before. So in another project, a SAN project that Dwayne and I actually started together about the renaming of a street in Berlin, that's also kind of one, a racial slur, but two, named after enslaved people. One of I interviewed people around the debate, and one account that I heard was somebody saying, you know, that this street bears testament to a long history of German-African friendship. And so changing the name would be kind of ignoring this history of friendship. So it's definitely a disturbing perspective. And one that in a way I try to unsettle, if not yet in the real world, then at least I like to think, okay, if it can't be changed yet, at least there's this kind of world that I can create for a few minutes in which something else is possible. And I think it's important for me to do that because there's this story I tell often, but basically when I was little, we were kind of also presented with the same kind of glorious account of colonialism. So that the Europeans came and they brought education and trade and currency in schools. And well, it was unfortunate because there was no self-determination, but you learn the benefits and the disadvantages. And one thing I remember when I was very little is I also couldn't kind of imagine a past of Africans or of Black people. because I had never been taught one. It had always started with the arrival of Europeans and then independence, and then, okay, people like me did something. So I couldn't imagine kind of before they arrived that anything had existed. And I think in a way that's something that's also at the back of my mind that informs a lot the kind of projects that I'm attracted to, or the work that I do in the first thread of my work. So in looking at what we remember and why we remember it. But yeah, doing this is also heavy sometimes. So then I also switched to focusing on care, etc., which I haven't really presented today. And yeah, the second thing I wanted to say, I liked the idea of new nonfiction film because I feel like there are probably more ideas of documentary, but the dominant ones that I remember, at least from film school, they're kind of the maybe simplified, but more American style documentaries where somebody kind of presents you with an argument and you're supposed to follow along and take all the evidence. And then there's also the kind of European documentary model, which was the idea that you find somebody and they tell you about all their deepest, darkest trauma, and you get close to them and you go into their kitchen, etc. That also never sat well with me because it also seemed a bit extractive. So I also think, in a way, kind of filming from things that I have a personal relation to or a personal stake in a way, is a way to kind of not fall into either of these models, and yeah, think beyond that and hopefully tell stories a bit more ethically. Yeah, that's it for now, but thank you for the comments.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for that, Nena, and thanks, Dylan, for your interventions. At this very moment, a drill has fired up in the apartment upstairs. It's very strange. I like this idea of new nonfiction films also, and opening up the ideas of like what is the purpose of a documentary film, and what kinds of truths is it enabled to explore. What are the limits of fiction? What are the limits of fiction that are you allowed to include in your documentary film? And then there's also, like, you look at Chloe Zhao's work also with the films and using non-professional actors, which is now a big trend in filmmaking also. And you watch a film like Nomadland and you're left with a sense of confusion of like, okay, so is this a documentary? Is it not a documentary? What is the trajectory of this film? Like, what is it meant to explore? So I think there's if we approach these themes from that angle, then the ideas of truth and fiction and the possibilities of mobilizing them are really generative. I think the idea, the exhibition that you cited, the Good Hope exhibition, I didn't see the Good Hope exhibition. I heard about it, but I did attend the Rijksmuseum's big slavery exhibition that they had this year. They opened it in April and it concluded at the end of August. And I think I caught it like a day or two before the exhibition actually closed. And these exhibitions, or at least with that exhibition, the problem was the teleology, right? Like the trajectory. So at the very end of the exhibition, you entered a room, a yellow room, and on the walls, like the Civil Rights Museum in Atlanta, Georgia, also very similar, with the words "freedom" all over the walls of the last room of the Rijksmuseum slavery exhibition. So in effect, they were trying to have a kind of neat closure to this narrative of slavery. But the main problem I had with that exhibition was that it didn't unsettle the institution itself, the Rijksmuseum, and how the Rijksmuseum actually accumulated the funds to be able to have works of art on the walls. That in fact, the exhibition was saying, implicitly it was saying, we wouldn't be able to tell the story of slavery unless we had these works on the walls. That was the implicit message that you received. We can tell the story of slavery because we have these artworks. It was an interesting transformation of of a story that's really painful and continues to resonate. So at this point, Tammy, I see that you're dropping a comment in the chat box. Do you want to come online and or on stage and pose your question directly to Nena? And anybody else who has a question, please do feel free to raise your hands. And it's an open platform, an open conversation. Please feel free. Tammy?
Hello. I've not yet transformed out of my pumpkin into a princess, so I'm gonna leave my camera off. But Nena, your work really reminds me of the approach I just watched the 4-part series of Raoul Peck, and he can't seem to distinguish between whether he's observing history or documenting history, or is he an actor or a narrator. And I think that positionality that is so confusing almost pluralizes his gaze in a sense. So I'm not sure if that resonates with you, but at least viewing it from the outside, it was very stunning to see how documentary and filmmakers are not deciding to take any stand in where an historical narrative they sit. And then I also like Mama Water because of the kind of sacrificial eating practice of the archive. I think here of Achille Mbembe's work of chronophagy, or the chronophagous nature of the archive, and the fact that like the state is someone who eats the past so that it can't have claims of reconciliation and repayment and debt. And I think maybe of Mama Waters as someone who's doing the opposite, or the same kind of like using these eating practices or sacrificial practices as a form of reparation. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, with you talking about, I love the connection to kind of Ashimbembe's work with chronophagy, because I think because I'm also studying these attempts at memorialization, and it's also a worry, I guess, that some activists have, which is the idea that once you campaign for so long, and I think this is maybe what happened in Lisbon for history to be recognized, and then once the city decides to recognize it, it kind of becomes engulfed in all of these debates and become used, as Dylan pointed out, to kind of represent the interculturality and the diversity of the state. So there's also this risk that it then, I don't know, it then becomes this victorious narrative, and then you're back almost where you started. So I hadn't thought of this connection, but I really like it. And in terms of the position to history, I'm gonna paste in the chat. There is this quote from Dion Brand's A Map to the Door of Return that I like a lot. She says kind of, one enters a room and history follows. One enters a room and history precedes. History is already seated in the chair in the empty room when one arrives. When one stands in a society, where one stands in a society seems always related to this historical experience. Where one can be observed is relative to that history. And I like to think of that also as, so I refer to silences officially, and spaces in which a particular narrative is left out. But I think in line with this, I also like to think, even if it's left out, that it's always there, and that it is possible just to listen to it and to highlight it. And for me, I guess this is one of the beauties of film, so that my background is in anthropology, film, and history, but there are some things that are harder, I guess, to write. I know Saidiya Hartman does a lot of this critical fabulation work, but it's still in some circles not seen as rigorous. And for me, then, I love the idea of having kind of the audiovisual or an artistic practice as a way to complicate yeah, what is otherwise gatekept as proper ways to do history, or proper sources, or proper ways to be an authority on topics. Thank you.
Thanks, Tammy, and thanks for your response also, Nina. And this is a great quote that you shared with us. I'm interested a little bit in the question of using film as a way of confronting the archive and confronting an existing archive. And I'm thinking back to a film. It just reminded me of this film. How do I pronounce this? Basically, in Spanish, it means, in English, it's A Storm is Coming. And it's a film by Javier Fernandez Vasquez. In fact, I reviewed this film for Africa as a Country. It's a documentary film where that's set in, I think it's set in Guinea, where the documentary filmmaker investigates a tragedy that occurred in the late 19th century in a village. But the only archival traces that he has is the official Spanish record. And of course, the Spanish record exonerates the perpetrators of this tragedy. And the filmmaker juxtaposes the reading of this record. He uses interlocutors to read the record with footage from the scenes as well as oral histories. But he uses a number of interesting visual devices for both carrying this story of the encounter with the archive, but also to undermine the veracity of archival records themselves as authoritative, legitimate, and the final word on what actually occurred in this event. So yeah, I'm thinking about these possible devices that can be employed for destabilizing the authority of the archive, and that is already percolating in your work through the use of speculating around ancestors and so on. So I'll drop the review in the chat. Maybe it's helpful for you and for others as well.
Yeah, thank you. That sounds, I'll check the film out. And no, I definitely like, another thing I like about filmmaking as a way to unsettle, or another thing that I find quite useful, is also that you can do very different things with sound and image. And that's also another way with the discrepancy to kind of unsettle, to present and unsettle a traditional narrative. So it's not something I showed today, but another project I made earlier this year, for instance, is, again, from personal experience, about a decade ago, some friends and I were part of a high school exchange trip from a high school in Ghana to Jackson, Mississippi. And a lot of things happened on the trip. I won't go into all of it. But one moment, for instance, is we were taken to a plantation, and we were told a kind of very particular account of history. So that this was owned by a really lovely, kind guy who was very wonderful to his workers. And we at the time, because in Ghana, you don't really also learn about slavery, you just learn that people were taken and the end. So because the show had focused on kind of the intricacies of harvesting cotton and how difficult it was to do, we were also fascinated by the industrial aspects of it, and by being able to see where our t-shirts were coming from. And we were encouraged to kind of pick souvenirs, and then they took a lot of pictures of us picking souvenirs, i.e. picking cotton in the field. And so then I tried to make a short film with my friends, with those of us who were on the trip. We were about 14, and obviously a decade later, a lot less naive about what happened. And I like the idea that it's not just the pictures, but you get to hear their accounts, their very varied accounts of what happened. But also the idea that then, because it's kind of animated, I kind of mentioned with Jenny, with John, that now I have more questions about repeating the same imagery that I'm critiquing. But then I get to kind of disrupt the pictures themselves by drawing on them, by distorting them, by showing some parts and not others. So yeah, I think for sure, there are ways that you can do this with writing, but yeah, I've also had a lot of fun and found it quite challenging with being able to do separate things on the audio and the visual layer, and the ways that that also allows you, also with the use of time, to kind of disrupt accounts of events.
Thanks, Nena. Please feel free to join in the conversation. Maybe there's a film or a documentary that you saw recently that you could reference and add to the conversation. We're trying to think about the ways in which the speculative, hauntings, ideas of ghosts can be mobilized for, disrupting ideas of time, disrupting ideas of archive, and especially unsettling the fixities of colonial legacies as well. You know, I was doing some research on ghosts this week, the last 2 weeks, in fact, because I have to write a conference paper, and I was doing research on ghosts in Cape Town, and Cape Town's a very touristy city, and we've got a rich both Dutch and British colonial heritage, which is marked in the landscape through these manor houses and buildings and so on. And if you do a search for like hauntings and ghosts in the city of Cape Town, you often find that these manor houses have some kind of weird ghost story attached to them. Like there's some weird ghost of the manor owner or manor owner's daughter who was tragically in love, and there was tragedy, and she perhaps passed away in this tragedy, and that's why the house is haunted. And so many of these sites are haunted in this way, but there are very few popular touristic narratives of the slaves who actually worked on these places, and how and in what ways they actually haunted. So it was interesting to observe how, so, like the way I put it in a very flippant way in my text was, there's a kind of spiritual apartheid that occurs, that even in death, the former homeowner gets to lay a claim to a position of that they had in life, whereas the spirits of the subalterns who exist in these places are not accorded the same popular status. So I think there's a hierarchy of ideas of spirituality that we also need to take into account when we think about ghosts, and how we consider them, and the respect that we accord to them also when referencing them and in our discussions. I see Lily, one of our students in the Honors in Curatorship course. Lily, you have your hand up.
Hi. Should I turn my camera on, or is it okay?
It's fine if you feel comfortable without your camera.
Okay, great. Thank you, Nena. This has been very inspiring and thought-provoking. I feel like I have a lot to think about, and I'm very grateful to you for speaking to us. Yeah, it's made me think a lot about ghosts at Cape Town, as Dwayne has mentioned. My research project this year is very much focused on colonial monuments and artworks of sort of apartheid leaders. And those kinds of things are also very much considered to be ghosts. So it almost feels like we have, I mean, I suppose anything can be a ghost, but there are the ghosts of the people who were disenfranchised by colonialism and by apartheid. And then on the other hand, we also have the ghosts of the people who caused these regimes and were complicit in them. And it kind of feels as if now, years later, the sort of narratives of these ghosts are kind of battling it out. And I think in Cape Town especially, the sort of colonial legacy gets a lot more attention than slave remains or the kind of more hidden aspects of our society. And I just, thank you. You've really made me think about this.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lily.
Yeah.
And just to update you, Nina, that our students are completing their end of year project. So Lily is, it's great that Lily is here, and one or two of our other students are also here, but most of them are busy finishing their end of year, finishing off their end of year projects. And since you're dealing with Ghost, Lily, maybe I can connect you with Nina so you can share some of your work with her on ghosts in Cape Town. Yeah, there's this idea of hierarchy of ghosts and categories of different spirits, right? Like that we can reference and refer to. Because if we take the dignity of spirits really seriously, and I'm speaking here with my background as someone with training in the religious studies, then we have to accept that there's a Western lexicon of what a ghost is, that comes from a very Abrahamic faith paradigm of some kind of spirit being that has some kind of unresolved business in the material world. And then in indigenous religious traditions, there are different classes and categories of non-human being that manifest in material form and in immaterial form also. So I think a sensitivity around this language is also something to consider and as being important, especially when perhaps when we're trying to mobilize the ancestors, let's say, for doing a kind of decolonial work.
Yeah, I mean, just to add, I relate to the idea of a hierarchy because I've seen like some films or had ideas for some films that sometimes have been looking at these histories, but I mean, I guess people model their characters after themselves, but have been looking at these histories through like embodying a ghost of a white person or an old colonialist or an old anthropologist who then kind of goes back to finish their work discovering Africa, etc. And I've always thought that that was interesting, that kind of even after death, they're then resurrected to do the same violence. So I just wanted to add that. And also because I work so much with this, another question I'm thinking about sometimes is consent. So also sometimes when people use the work of actual people, so old pictures or audio that was recorded under duress or in circumstances of capture, and kind of how do you deal with it then, or if you have permission to use it, or if you can claim to be then if you're speculating speaking for the ghosts. And I've also been thinking about the idea of refusal, because for a project that I haven't finished in Namibia, I was talking to some of the traditional leaders also about ghosts and how they contact them in their practice. And they had mentioned, you know, that you ask a question and if they want, they will answer you. And I've always wondered kind of how the work can engage with that, you know, that if they answer you, then you make a film, and if they don't answer you, is there a way to acknowledge that as well? I guess similar to Jenny with John, like, is there a way to go past this idea that because you're claiming to work with ghosts, that they always cooperate or that they always agree with what you're doing? Yeah, those are just a few thoughts. In terms of what is next, I'm finishing, I guess, some projects that I've been doing for a while. I'm researching because I'm also doing a PhD, and then next year, by the end of the year, I'm hoping to do a project on Biafra and the Biafran War and different memories on that. So I guess a bunch of different things, but all around the same question of how do we remember and what are we choosing not to remember?
Awesome, thanks, Nina. That sounds so exciting. You're so busy and so active, and you didn't even tell us about your was the opening this week of your exhibition Wash Day?
Yeah, there was one in Berlin last week and today in London actually, but I won't be going. But yeah, that's been really fun. I'm looking forward to going to
Nice, wonderful. So I'd encourage all of our participants to visit Nena's website. Also, I guess following you on Instagram is also one of the best ways to see what you're working on and what's current and what's going on. So look Nena up on Instagram as well. Nena, this was such an enriching conversation, and I'm really, really inspired. It was so wonderful to engage with your work. Really, really, really. It was really, really exciting and inspiring, especially on a Friday afternoon, and we haven't seen each other for a while. So I'm really glad to see what you're busy working on at the moment.